What is vacancy decontrol and will it hurt or help tenants in the province of Ontario? Let's find out. I'm Michael Ouzas. I'm a realtor in the Greater Toronto Area, and a lot of the talk these days has been about the rental market here in the city of Toronto. Now, about a month ago, there was some talk about possibly trying to end the vacancy decontrol. And what is it? What does that even mean? Let's go through a few articles and break it down. Before we continue, I'm on a challenge to try to get to 100 subscribers by the end of this year. By doing videos like these, I want to put as much information I can to help you better understand what's going on in the real estate market, not just buying and selling, but all things. If you're a landlord, learning about tenant rights, anything in between, these videos are for you. If you ever want to book in a call with me, you can click the link in the description down below and book in my calendar at any given time. So let's jump right into it. And the first article here on stories.com, you guys know I like to reference this website. They always put some really great articles out here. This was written by Zakaya Kasim back on July 19, 2022. And the title, Ending Vacancy Decontrol in Ontario, Will It Hurt or Help? As we move along here, as originally reported by the Toronto Star, a report has gone to City Council today that made the case, remember this was back in July, for eliminating a rule known as vacancy decontrol. As it currently stands, long-term tenants are somewhat protected by vacancy decontrol because landlords are restricted to annual rent increases based on the Ontario Consumer Price Index. That annual increase tends to be between 0.5 and 3%. This year was 1.2%, last year was 0%, and next year is 2.5%. But little is stopping landlords from forcing long-term renters out so they can hike rental rates for new tenants. On top of that, there is no rent control regulation to speak of for new tenants. So as we're going to jump into this article a little further, basically vacancy decontrol is the ability for landlords to raise the rent to whatever market rate between tenants. So if the building in Ontario, if your property was occupied before November 15, 2018, you're only allowed to raise the rent by the Consumer Price Index, as just discussed. If your property was occupied after November 15, 2018, you can raise the rent to market rate one time per year or every 12 months. You do have to give 90 days notice, but the vacancy decontrol rule would be that between tenants, you can't change the rent. As it stands right now, even if you have a property occupied before November 15, 2018, and that tenant moves out, you can raise the rent to whatever the market rate is between tenants. It also goes on to say, at first blush, Bond's recommendation to end vacancy decontrol seems like a no-brainer, and city spokesperson Siobhan Ramsey confirmed to the Star that the housing staff are officially in support of the rule changes. That said, there's debate over scrapping the rule. On one hand, the Bond's report has been met with support from Ontario housing advocates, including the Advocacy Centre for Tenants in Ontario. Now, going through this article, there are a lot of debates on either side. So on the one side, Bond's recommendation to end vacancy decontrol seems like a no-brainer. City spokesperson Siobhan Ramsey confirmed to the Star that housing staff are officially in support of the rule change. That said, there's debate over scrapping the rule. As we pop down here, it says new and enhanced investments are urgently needed to deliver the city's Housing TO 2020 to 2030 action plan, which aims to approve 40,000 new affordable rental homes, including 18,000 supporting housing units by 2030, prevent homelessness and evictions, improve housing stability for residents across the city, and ensure well-maintained affordable homes. Nonetheless, some housing officials maintain that vacancy decontrol exists for a reason, and ending it would only exacerbate the housing crisis further. It's a fundamental, very important policy lever, if you will, to be able to allow for rental housing providers to maintain and upkeep their buildings and provide necessary upgrades and improvements. It also provides certainty in the system for those who build housing. That's from Tony Irwin, President and CEO, Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, as he told Stories, where this article is coming from. In our view, taking away measures such as that is not going to do anything to create more housing. It's really going to have a much more negative effect in terms of rental housing providers, builders, saying this is not an environment that we're going to invest in because projects are not economically viable. If we flip over here to an article from the Financial Post, it says rent controls and vacancy decontrol hurt renters just as much as landlords. Rent controls hurt the long-term welfare of those who rent such units. And this was back on June 27th, 2022. Rent controls are a controversial policy instrument that left-leaning political parties and many housing advocates believe are necessary to improve housing affordability, but most economists disagree because they believe rent controls eliminate the incentive for landlords to either build new purpose-built rental housing or maintain existing rental housing in a state of good repair. The belief that rent controls work is essentially influenced by the short-term welfare of existing renters, but the rental prospects for future tenants are compromised when sufficient new rental units are not built because landlords are wary of revenue uncertainty. In places with a growing population, rental demand will increase over time. If there aren't enough purpose-built rental units, prospective tenants will be forced to rent from private landlords whose properties are often more expensive and do not offer the security of tenure. So it's really interesting to go through these articles, and there's a few reasons why. On the first side of things is that vacancy decontrol, basically if someone was renting an apartment like 2 years ago at $1,800 a month for a one bedroom in downtown Toronto, currently that same apartment rents for about $2,400 a month. So in that interim, if that original tenant had moved out, then the landlord could take the property back and get it up to speed. Maybe they need to do some renovations, get it up to par, or just freshly painted or whatever, get it back on the market and supply the rental again for someone else. This time they could do it at $2,400. If that rent were to stay at $1,800, maybe that landlord might not be as excited to paint the walls and get it up and running again. And if that property is older than November 15th, 2018, they can only raise the rent by about $20 a month. Now, going through these articles, I hope that taught you what vacancy decontrol is and what it means to those here looking to rent in Ontario. In Toronto specifically, prices have jumped up significantly from where they were last year, but we have to keep in mind where we were last year. And we also have to keep in mind that 2 years ago, landlords were not allowed to raise the rent at all for 2 years with their tenants. This year was at 1.2%, which again is not exactly, if those costs have gone up significantly in the last few years, 1.2% is not exactly a number that's going to help the landlord be able to even put a paint job on a condo. And next year it's at 2.5%. Again, that's if those properties are older than November 15th, 2018. Now, I will say that for landlords and tenants, I think one problem that would arise on both sides is that tenants are going to want a lower price, but landlords are going to want a higher price. And then what's going to happen is there's going to be a very big imbalance between the two. And I think that if landlords are not allowed to raise the rent for however long, I mean, basically, if they're not allowed to raise it ever, they're just going to take a really, really high number at the start. And then tenants on the other side are going to expect that price to be much lower, but something's going to have to give at some point. I don't know if it's going to help either party either way. I do think that the way things are now, where the property is older than November 15, 2018, I think on the tenant side, maybe that's something that they'll want to look into more so than a newer property. And on the purchaser side, or landlord side, maybe those properties that are older than November 15, 2018 have some good pros in them. You know how the buildings have been run and the consistency of the units and typically better layouts. And then on the newer side of things, they can raise the rent by market rate every single year. So there's pros and cons to both, and I really don't think we can paint the whole thing in one color. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on the topic and what you think would be the best for everybody, or if you think one is better than the other, let me know. If you ever want to book in a call with me, there's a link in the description down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can always like and subscribe and follow me on all social media at Michael Ouzas Real Estate.